Thank you for joining me on this episode of Blister Prevention Office Hours. We're going to be looking at the Hashmi study, all about posterior heel blisters. And I had intended to look at this in greater detail last month, but it just morphed into its own presentation. So now we're going to be talking about this paper. If you didn't catch last month's, I highly recommend you take a look because it was a really good discussion about posterior heel blisters and all the relevant factors. We had a good look at the relative motion scenarios at heel lift and heel strike, had a quick look at research, and we delved into quite some depth on how all the preventions work. So if you are here to look at what works as a blister prevention for the posterior heel, then definitely head back to last month's episode and watch that, but obviously stick around for this one. So yeah, we're going to look at the Hashmi research, we look at the aims, the methods, and all of the findings and implications. So this is the paper. It was called The Formation of Friction Blisters on the Foot, the development of a laboratory-based blister creation model, and it was in the Skin Research and Technology journal, and it was by Farina Hashmi, Barry Richards, Saeed Forghany, Anna Hatton, and Chris Nestor. What they did was they produced blisters on the posterior heel with this setup and jig. I'm going to explain this in more detail in a moment. So the aims were twofold. What they wanted to do was have a look at how digital infrared thermographic imaging correlated with the contact method, which is like just a normal thermometer basically, where it's actually got to touch the skin, and also to describe the temperature changes before, during, and after blister formation with both methods. This is what a digital infrared thermographic imaging camera looks like. I got this picture off eBay. This wouldn't have been the one they used, but it was essentially this kind of thing. And it produces this kind of image. And this is an example of the images that they were able to produce before, during, and after blister formation, indicating temperatures and temperature change. So the methods, they were 30 subjects, and they had this load application mechanism set up, which looks fantastic. It's a spring-operated rotating load applicator with a curved surface covered with textured rubber, providing a high frictional interface with the skin. So basically, as that applicator moved up and down, because of the high friction level, it grabbed the skin and moved it with it, thereby creating the shear deformation in the soft tissues between skin surface and bone. And temperature readings were taken before, during, and after blister creation. How much did this load applicator move? It moved 15 millimeters, which 1.5 centimeters, about that much. It seems like a lot, but the reason they used that amount was they found in an unpublished pilot study that that's how much the foot moves relative to the shoe at heel strike. So being unpublished, obviously we couldn't take a bit of a look at it, but I think this needs verification. I'm not doubting that it's true, but I have a feeling that most podiatrists wouldn't be comfortable with the fact that the heel moves relative to the shoe 15 millimeters with each step. So presumably there's a bit of heel fat pad deformation under the heel that's responsible for that. But how much is the heel lifting at heel lift? Because presumably what goes up must come down. So that would be a tidy little experiment for someone who's got some slow motion, high speed video to actually replicate and publish. The loading cycle. So the load applicator was operated at a rate of 120 passes per minute, so 60 up and 60 down. So it went up, down, for 2 minutes. And that speed kind of was chosen to replicate fast walking. And so the load was applied for 2 minutes, and then they had a 1 minute break, and they needed that 1 minute to take the temperature recordings and also to inspect the skin to see whether a blister had formed, because that was the end point of the load application. So temperatures were recorded every 3 minutes during the load application. So 2 minutes of load, 1 minute of temperature recording, and every 3 minutes still for the 30 minutes post blister formation. The subjects remained standing and had those measurements taken every 3 minutes. And then for the next 5 hours, the temperature was measured every hour, and the participants were allowed to leave the room at this stage. They just weren't able to wear shoes on any of these areas of their foot. As I mentioned, the endpoint was the loading was the initiation of the blister injury, and that is a blanched area of skin with an erythematous, within an erythematous inflamed area of skin, and or a visible pleat of epidermis lifted from the underlying dermis. So that's what it looks like when a blister first forms and hasn't yet had a chance to fill with fluid. So let's get to the meat of the discussion. We're going to talk about their findings and implications, etc. First of all, there was a consistent pattern of clinical signs. That was redness initially. They termed this a hotspot. Probably not that importantly for this research, but just things that I think about is a hotspot a clinical sign, or is it a subjective symptom? I think a lot of people, our patients, describe hotspots as a symptom rather than something that they see. But as I said, probably not important to this discussion. So initial redness, blanching of the skin in response to load, and the appearance of a small pleat of epidermis that subsequently filled with fluid. It takes up to 2 hours to fill with fluid, usually about an hour. It's not full of fluid straight away. A consistent pattern of symptoms were described. That is, initial rubbing sensation followed by a stinging sensation, which then subsided until a sharp pain was felt, heralding the initiation of a blister. And this is in line with other descriptions surrounding blister formation. Time to blister varied greatly. In this study, it was between 4 and 32 minutes. The authors speculate this variation could be due to surface hydration. Definitely, different people will sweat different rates over that time, but it could just be the intrinsic resilience to shear strain or shear stress over that time, because everyone's skin and subcutaneous tissue can deal with it a bit better or less better than others. And if we look at the other experimental blister research papers, we can see that there is this vast range of time to blister. So Salzberger, who produced blisters on the palms, it was between 3 minutes and even after 50 minutes of load. It was a linear load like this Hashmi study in 2013. Some people still hadn't blistered after 50 minutes. And Naylor, who produced blisters on the anterior shins of medical students back in 1955, it was between 27 and 138 load applications. So there's a big range, a big difference for different people. Remembering that they were looking to see if there's correlation between the contact and the non-contact forms of temperature measurement, they found that there was good correlation. The degrees Celsius wasn't exactly the same, but the changes all correlated very well. So the good thing about this is it supports the use of a non-contact way of measuring temperature, which obviously has advantages because when you apply a thermometer to the skin, that could actually change skin temperature itself. And plus there's the need for contact. So yeah, the infrared non-contact has many advantages. Temperature changes over time. So from baseline to blister formation, temperature increased. And then once the blister formed and the load was no longer applied, temperature reduced. And we'll just have a look at that in a bit more detail. So at the control site, things remained relatively constant in terms of temperature. At the test site, the median increase from the point of baseline to blister formation was an increase of 5.1 degrees Celsius. Now, in future papers that used a similar setup to this, they used 3 degrees Celsius temperature increase as indicating imminent blister formation, but the 3 degrees wasn't mentioned in this paper. So they've obviously done further statistical analysis to come up with that 3 degrees. So I'll just touch briefly on a couple of papers subsequent to this that use the same setup, and they were looking for a 3 degree increase in temperature to to indicate imminent blister formation. But the median increase was 5.1 degrees Celsius, and actually the range was relatively large. The range at blister formation compared to baseline was between 1.7 degrees and 9.9 degrees. 30 minutes after blister formation, temperature had reduced significantly, but it was still above baseline, and it was still above baseline, albeit reduced, 5.5 hours after the load had finished. So that's a long time. So the authors discuss, since the skin temperature increase after repeated applications of load, it is reasonable to assume that a physiological inflammatory response was initiated and responsible for the recorded skin temperature increases. This demonstrates that our method quantified the pre and post blister physiological inflammatory changes that occur in response to external loads. Also, that these temperature changes were not due to superficial frictional heat, nor changes in environmental temperature, at least for up to 30 minutes post-blister, because remember, after that time, they were allowed to leave the room. And so the ambient temperature wasn't standardized. One thing they didn't expect to find, the concurrent rise in the temperature of the skin site between the medial malleolus and the back of the heel was not expected. This was noted in all participants, but presented at different times during the experiment, and the surface areas affected by this heat varied. So that's like the big, on each of those images, there's a big red patch at the top left, and then you can see the blister at the back of the heel, which is a bit to the right of that. And you can see this spike of temperature between the two. So that was something they didn't expect to see. This phenomenon might offer a surrogate measure of events occurring at the site of the blister. This has the added value of providing us with a site that can be used for data collection whilst the test site is physically covered, for example, by footwear or a blister dressing. So we could potentially, if we could measure temperature change somewhere other than the blister site, we could cover that blister site with a blister prevention and just test how effective it is at changing temperature increases. Really fascinating. Right, a quick discussion on the observation of skin thickness. It was anticipated that the subcutaneous tissue thickness would not vary greatly at this site, and it was not measured. However, observations made via palpation and during load application showed that the tissue thickness at the test site did vary between participants. So this is quite fascinating. So if we think about tissue thickness, we're comparing thin skin to thick skin. So with thin skin, there's the skin, that not only is the skin and particularly the epidermis much thinner, it's 9% thicker on the plantar surface than it is on the dorsal surface of the foot, that is the epidermis, and it's less tethered. So there's more movement able to happen in that skin and soft tissue compared to on the palm. You don't get much movement because it's firmly tethered to underlying structures, and we know that it's much thicker. The authors say that this corroborates the work conducted by Salzberg et al., which suggests that the prerequisites for blister formation on palmar skin, so Salzberg produced blisters on the palms, thick stratum corneum and tight adherence of the skin to underlying tissues. Now, the bit at the top is what they actually say in the paper, which is actually opposite to what they talk about or discuss and what Salzberg found. So if I just read that, thicker skin appeared to move more readily during load application than thinner skin. Well, that just doesn't seem to be the case in at least here and in terms of what Salzberg was talking about. And then they said thinner skin appeared more tethered. Well, this is tethered. That's not tethered to underlying structures. So I'm not sure whether they got themselves mixed up with this, or whether I'm reading it wrong, or whether they actually found different things to Sulzberger. Yeah. To clarify, this is what Sulzberger found in terms of blister formation. Basically, we need a thick epidermis to be able to withstand repetitive shear deformation, to be able to still be intact and hold a fluid-filled lesion, and it needs to be adhered firmly to underlying structures. Essentially, they say these prerequisites explain why friction blisters do not generally occur clinically where the skin is loose or the stratum corneum thin. That is why palmar and plantar skin and such sites as the heels, I presume they're talking about the posterior heel, blister most regularly in response to friction. They have both of the necessary requirements: a thick stratum corneum for blister roof and tight adherence of the skin to underlying structures. What happens when we produce blisters on thin skin is at the point of intraepidermal tear or fatigue, the initiation of the blister injury, the roof comes right off straight away. So there's not, because it's just not able to withstand the repetitive shear deformation. And that's why we get more blisters, at least fluid-filled blisters, on thick skin. When we get blisters on thinner skin, they tend to de-roof because it just can't sustain or withstand repetitive shear deformation. But I do agree with Farina Hashmi and colleagues when they say future work in this area should consider the use of ultrasound imaging to clarify the possible contribution of the subcutaneous tissue mechanics to skin blistering. That would be fascinating. I would just be fascinated to, understand that in more detail. Okay, getting towards the end, although the degree of compression applied by the load applicator was standardized, it is not clear how this level compares with actual forces experienced by the skin when walking in a shoe. What is normal peak pressure at the posterior heel? Has it ever been measured? I don't know. I couldn't find any information. And we spoke very briefly about this last month. Is the shear event at the posterior heel unidirectional or bidirectional, biphasic? This experiment created a biphasic shear event, a shear event up and a shear event down. But then the authors discuss how it's actually the shear event that happens at heel strike, which is the most important. And perhaps they should have just used that, a jig that just replicated that instance at heel strike. I don't know so much. I mean, they say the heel strike shear event is more important, but they don't actually provide a reference. So I think that's a little bit of work to be done. Is the shear event that happens at heel lift negligible, or is it something that should be considered? Now, the reason it's important is blisters are caused by repetitive shear deformation, and the repetitive part of that is important. And if shear is happening twice per step rather than once per step, then blisters are going to occur more readily. Albeit the shear events are happening in opposite directions, it's still happening twice rather than once. And Yavuz and colleagues in 2008 showed this for the plantar surface, how the plantar forefoot undergoes a biphasic shear event with every step, whereas the plantar heel only one per step. And that may go towards explaining why plantar forefoot blisters and ulcers are much more common than plantar heel blisters. So a little bit of work to be done there, I think. Okay, concluding statements, just to really hammer home how important this research was and how fascinating it was. The factors causing the formation of foot blisters cannot be precisely controlled or readily analysed in field conditions. So this little setup really was fantastic. This paper describes how change in foot skin temperature can be quantified non-invasively during the formation of friction heel blisters. This is the first report concerning the controlled creation of foot blisters and the concurrent measurement of physiological change within the skin. Definitely. The load application mechanism was able to provide the appropriate amount of compression and friction forces to the skin to generate friction blisters. So it was a really great little piece of kit. The scale of temperature change during these stages of blister creation, along with the consistency across subjects, suggests that temperature would be a suitable measure for testing risk factors associated with friction blister formation. So temperature could be something that we look at to look at different mechanics of the skin and soft tissue, and also obviously different preventions. Moreover, this information will contribute to a greater understanding of how prevention or treatment strategies might interfere with the underlying risks of blister formation. So implement prevention, measure the temperature change, and compare it to without the intervention, and it could show some very interesting information about how effective a prevention is at preventing blisters, basically, via temperature change. Creating blisters on the feet for the purposes of research does expose participants to risk. The need to cause blistering in future may not be necessary, as these data clearly show measurable changes in temperature in the time preceding blister creation. And this was used in a couple of papers subsequent to this that used that 3-degree increase in temperature to indicate imminent blister formation. And these are the papers. So one was by Farina Hashmi, was involved in both. So Kirkham and Suzanne Kirkham, Sharon Lamb, Chris Nestor, and Farina Hashmi did one on the effect of hydration. They basically put one foot in a bucket of water, one not, and they applied the load with this. It looks like a sort of a modernized piece of equipment, or the jig, the load application mechanism. And they found that the hydrated skin had an increase in temperature much faster than the dry skin. And then that was in 2014. And in 2016, they tested a couple of prevention strategies. So this was Farina Hashmi, Suzanne Kirkham, Chris Nestor, and Sharon Lamb. And they looked at 3 products: 2 times Blister Shield powder, Flexitol Blistop, and an antiperspirant, Boots antiperspirant or something. And they found that there was no significant difference between temperature changes with and without the intervention. So that was interesting. It kind of indicates that those preventions don't work. It would be great to be able to just apply this to all the preventions in the world and see whether we can find something that does affect temperature change. But to my knowledge, these are the only 2 follow-up studies that have been done. So yeah, fantastic work by Farina Hashmi and colleagues, really enlightening. I wish I had that jig to be able to, have a bit of a play with, and even the infrared camera would be it would definitely be fascinating. So that basically concludes the discussion of the paper. We'll move on to Q&A now. Now, if you've got a question and you're on the call, just feel free to either put on your microphone or type it in the chat. I'll get my chat up now, and I'll answer it. But we got 3 questions at the time of sign up. So thank you for the questions that came in. They're all kind of along the same theme. So they are on sweaty feet and are moisture levels important to the formation of blisters? What do I want to say about this? Yes, moisture is important to the formation of blisters. It's one reason why the friction level of the skin and whatever it interfaces with increases. So yes, it is important. Is it the be-all and end-all of blister prevention? Definitely not. So while it's important to manage moisture to some degree, it's not the only way to prevent blisters, and we can prevent blisters in more sophisticated ways, or just ways that hone in on a different mechanism and allow the foot to be damp and a high friction level at the skin surface. So there's nothing more frustrating to me when people contact me and say, or indicate that they've kind of given into the inevitability of blisters because they recognize the fact that they can't keep their feet dry. And yeah, so basically, yes, let's manage moisture. If you want to have a good discussion on all the ins and outs of that, I did a presentation about a year and a bit ago on the moisture management strategies. We looked at socks, we looked at powders and antiperspirants. So I won't go through all that now. Definitely, if you head over to pro.blisterprevention.com office hours and listen to that, it'll go through all the ins and outs. And Marianne asks, are moisture wicking material socks better than merino wool? I did a presentation on this a little while ago too, so check that one out because it goes through everything in more detail. I wish I had an easy, quick answer, yes or no, but the fact is we don't know. And I don't think there's enough. Doug and I have spoken about this a lot. Doug is quite the authority on socks and blister management and just socks in general. I'm going to put in the chat a link to our paper because it just lays out all the research to date on this topic. So moisture wicking, basically, it's a synthetic material. It doesn't absorb any water. It just allows the free flow of water in and out, thereby not holding water against the skin. Merino wool does a bit of that, but it also is able to hold water. And in a study in it was the army or hiking, they were using Gore-Tex boots, so there was limited ability for moisture to evaporate through the upper of the shoe, and they found that the wool sock worked better than the moisture wicking sock. So in that scenario, at least when there's more moisture that remains in the shoe, wool showed that it outperformed synthetic or moisture wicking. There's definite, mechanisms and theoretical concepts around how moisture wicking helps, but there's just not enough proper research in the field related to blister formation as to whether it actually works. So the easy answer here is I don't know, and I wish I had an answer, but essentially to get past this, I just get people to get a sock that is comfortable. We know, thanks to Ritchie and Herring research in the early 1990s, that a thicker sock is better than a thinner sock. They compared cotton and acrylic, 100% cotton, 100% acrylic, and the acrylic outperformed the cotton in terms of blister formation in runners when both socks were thick. But when both socks were thin, there was no protective effect of the acrylic. So thicker is better. But yeah, there's so much more research to be done. It's difficult research to do. You've got the raw material. When we think about wool, you've got the raw material, but then it's like washed and all the lanolin taken out of it, and then a bit of lanolin's put back in, and then it's prepared to be shipped, and then it's added to other materials, and then it's knitted in different weaves and things, so terry and all that kind of stuff. So there's just so many factors, it's impossible to draw any conclusions to date. So get a sock that's comfortable. Thicker is better than thin in theory, but that's not to say that if you wear thin socks you're going to get blisters. You can just concentrate on something other than that. If it's cold, wool's probably better. So merino wool compared to others, we know that merino wool is a relatively fine, I'll discuss this all in this presentation here, so I probably shouldn't go through it now, but merino wool is a small micron wool fibre, whereas other fibres are a higher micron. They have more of a medulla, and the medulla is what can store water. So knowing that that's not in merino wool, and yet merino wool socks have been found to hold more water, yeah, again, I don't know. So Oh, that feels really inadequate, but that's just the state of the research. So have a read of Doug's and my paper here, and it goes through all the ins and outs of what the research says so that you can come to your own conclusions. Okay, guys, I think that is about it. Let me get my... Any questions? Right, okay, well, we're a minute over, so I think we'll leave it there. If you are watching the replay, you can always find the replays. Go to pro.blisterprevention.com. Up here at the Learn tab, click that little arrow and you'll find office hours. That's where we keep the replays. So if you have any questions, send me an email. We'll be here next Wednesday, first Wednesday of the month. Sorry, not next Wednesday, the first Wednesday of every month. If there's a topic that you want me to cover, let me know and I'll definitely consider it. At the moment, I don't know what I'm discussing next month. So that's that. I hope you learned a little bit. Thanks to Hashmi and colleagues for this brilliant study. It has been fantastic. So with that, I will say goodbye and thanks for joining me and we shall catch you later.